When I first moved into the apartment, I thought I'd found the perfect place. It was on the third floor of a historic building tucked away in an old neighborhood in Boston. The rent was reasonable, especially for the area, and the apartment itself had character. There was something appealing about its worn wooden floors, high ceilings, and the faint smell of old paper and dust. The kind of place you'd find in a novel. But even from the beginning, there was a strange energy to the building. Maybe it was the way the floorboards creaked unpredictably, or how the narrow hallways felt almost too quiet, as if the walls themselves absorbed any noise that dared to echo. My neighbors were quiet, almost invisible. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of someone entering or leaving an apartment, but they never lingered. It was the kind of place where everyone kept to themselves. The first few nights were uneventful, just the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling at night. I'd lie in bed, lulled by the sounds, telling myself they were part of the building's charm. But on the third night, something changed. I woke up to a faint sound coming from the wall next to my bed. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone gently knocking. It was so subtle that at first I thought it was my imagination. I held my breath, straining to listen, and there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. It was deliberate, steady, and chillingly close, as though it were coming from the other side of the wall, from the room next door. I told myself it was probably just the pipes or some kind of structural noise. But there was something unsettling about it, something too intentional. I shifted uncomfortably, waiting for the sound to stop, but it continued, persistent and unyielding. Eventually, I managed to drift back to sleep, but a lingering sense of unease remained. The next day, I passed by my neighbor's door in the hallway, curious to see if anyone was living there. The door was closed, no sounds, no signs of life. I figured they were just quiet or maybe kept odd hours. But that night the tapping returned, and it was louder. This time it was accompanied by something else, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was haunting, almost as if it were calling to me. I sat up in bed, staring at the wall, my heart pounding. I wanted to knock back, to somehow respond, but fear held me in place. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, listening to the soft whispering and the rhythmic tapping. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard something else. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth in the room next door. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. I lay there, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive, like the entire building was holding its breath. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to focus on my usual routine, but the memory of the sounds haunted me. I found myself glancing nervously at the wall, half expecting to hear the tapping again. That evening, I decided to ask the janitor, Mr. Higgins, about the room next door. Mr. Higgins was an older man with a stooped posture and a face weathered by years of work. I found him in the hallway, sweeping the floor with a look of tired resignation. "Excuse me, Mr. Higgins," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know if anyone lives in the apartment next to mine?" He paused, giving me a strange look, before shaking his head. "No, son. That room's been empty for a while now," he replied, his voice gruff. "Nobody's lived there since that boy disappeared." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Disappeared?" Mr. Higgins nodded, his eyes clouding over with a mixture of sadness and something else, fear maybe. "A few years back, young fellow about your age, moved in, kept to himself. Then one night he was just gone. No note, no warning. They say he complained about strange noises coming from the walls, too. He stopped, eyeing me carefully. Why? You hearing things? I hesitated, not sure if I should tell him, but the memory of the whispers, the footsteps, was too real to ignore. Yes, I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady. Every night I hear tapping, whispers, even footsteps. It feels like someone's there, just on the other side of the wall. Mr. Higgins' face paled, and he looked away, as if the mere mention of it made him uncomfortable. Best you ignore it, he muttered, almost to himself. Some things are better left alone. That night I lay in bed, replaying his words in my mind. Some things are better left alone. But how could I ignore something that felt so real, so present? As the hours ticked by, I waited, knowing the sounds would return, that the presence lurking in the darkness would make itself known once again. And then, right on cue, the tapping began. It was louder this time, more insistent, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side was growing impatient. The whispers returned, and this time they were clearer. I could almost make out words, phrases, but they slipped away before I could grasp them, like smoke drifting through my fingers. My heart raced as the footsteps started again, pacing back and forth, drawing closer with each step. I pressed my hand against the wall, feeling the cold surface beneath my palm. It was thin, almost as if there was barely anything separating me from the room next door. And then through the silence, I heard it. A single, chilling word, whispered with a haunting clarity that left no room for doubt. Daniel. I lay there, paralyzed, the sound of my own name echoing in my head. Daniel? The whisper was soft, almost pleading, like it was calling from somewhere far away. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but the cold, heavy air pressing down on me assured me this was no dream. Whatever was in that room next door wasn't content to stay hidden anymore. Hours passed before I could move. Even as the sun began to filter through the blinds, casting weak light across my room, I couldn't shake the voice or the way it had made me feel. I kept thinking of Mr. Higgins' warning, his words playing on repeat. Some things are better left alone. But now, it felt like there was no escaping it. Determined to make sense of what was happening, I forced myself to go about my day. I went to class, tried to focus on my work, and acted as if everything was fine. But every time my mind wandered, I found myself back in that room. Back to the whispers, the footsteps, the feeling of a presence just out of sight. It gnawed at me, refusing to let go. When night fell again, I was a bundle of nerves. I sat on my bed, staring at the wall, waiting. Part of me hoped the sounds wouldn't come back, that it had all been in my head. But deep down, I knew that was wishful thinking. Just as I was beginning to feel a sense of calm, the tapping began again. This time, it was different. Louder, more insistent, each tap echoing in the stillness of my room. I got up, heart racing, and pressed my ear to the wall. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, steady and rhythmic, like someone was standing just inches away on the other side. A chill ran down my spine, but I stayed, listening, waiting, and then the whisper returned. "Help me," it said, the voice strained and broken, filled with desperation. I pulled back, my pulse thundering in my ears. The voice sounded so real, so human, yet there was something about it that felt wrong, like it was coming from somewhere it didn't belong. Unable to ignore it any longer, I did something I hadn't dared to do before. I left my apartment and stepped into the hallway, moving slowly toward the door of the empty room next to mine. It was closed, as it always was, but I noticed something different. A faint light seeping from beneath the door, flickering as if from a dying candle. I reached out, my hand shaking as I wrapped my fingers around the doorknob. It felt cold, almost icy, sending a shock through my skin. I tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, as though it were determined to keep whatever was inside trapped. I leaned in, pressing my ear against the door, and heard it again. Footsteps, soft and shuffling, like someone pacing back and forth in a small, confined space. The whispers resumed, barely audible, but clear enough to make my skin crawl. "Please, help me. I don't want to be alone." The desperation in the voice tore through me, filling me with a strange mix of fear and pity. Whoever this was, they were trapped, lost in some liminal space that I couldn't understand. But how could I help them? How could I even begin to confront something that seemed to defy all logic? I stepped back, my mind racing. I needed answers, something more tangible than the whispers and footsteps. I thought of Mr. Higgins and how he had reacted when I asked him about the room. He had seemed almost afraid, as if the mere mention of it brought back memories he'd rather forget. The next morning, I found him near the entrance, sweeping the floor with a vacant expression on his face. I approached him slowly, my pulse quickening as I prepared to ask the question that had been haunting me. "Mr. Higgins," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to know more about what happened in that room next to mine, about the boy who disappeared." He paused, his grip tightening on the broom handle. For a moment he didn't respond, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. Finally, he let out a sigh, his shoulders slumping as though he were carrying an immense weight. "His name was Peter," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Young man, not much older than you, moved in alone, kept to himself. But he started hearing things. Said there were voices, footsteps, just like you've been hearing." My mouth went dry as his words sank in. "What happened to him?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Mr. Higgins shook his head, his expression grim. "One night, he just vanished. No one saw him leave, no signs of struggle. It was like he disappeared into thin air." He glanced at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "The police searched, asked questions, but they found nothing. The room's been empty ever since." A heavy silence settled between us. I wanted to ask more, to understand how someone could simply vanish, but I could see the pain in his face, the way his hands trembled slightly as he clutched the broom. I nodded, thanking him softly, and walked away, my mind reeling. That night, I lay in bed, Mr. Higgins's words looping through my head. I tried to make sense of it, to rationalize what I had heard. But the fear, the uncertainty, made it impossible. All I knew was that the room next to mine held a secret, something dark and hungry, something that refused to be ignored. As the hours passed, I felt the familiar weight of dread settle over me, thick and suffocating. I tried to focus on my breathing, to calm myself, but the silence felt heavy, charged with an energy that seemed to pulse through the walls. And then, just as I was beginning to think the night might pass in peace, the tapping began again. I gripped the edge of my bed, my knuckles white as I listened. The taps were slow, deliberate, each one punctuating the silence with an eerie finality. Then came the footsteps, pacing back and forth, closer than before. I could feel them vibrating through the floor, like someone was walking just inches from my bed. And then, through the wall, came the whisper. "Help me, Daniel. Help me." This time, it was unmistakable. The voice wasn't just asking for help. It was calling out to me by name. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as the implication sank in. Whatever was in that room knew me, knew I was here, listening. It wanted something from me, something I didn't understand. I lay there, my mind racing, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. I was trapped, caught between fear and fascination, unable to look away from the horror unfolding on the other side of the wall. As the whispers faded into silence, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever this presence was, It had found me, and I had a sickening feeling that it wouldn't rest until I answered its call. That night, I lay in bed, gripped by a feeling of dread that was heavier than anything I'd ever felt before. The walls seemed to close in around me, their silence suffocating, pressing down like a weight on my chest. I tried to reason with myself, to find some explanation for the events of the last few days, but nothing made sense. Every logical thought dissolved into a haze of fear, leaving me with a single, undeniable truth. There was something in that room next door, something that needed me, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I got up, my body trembling as I crossed the room. I didn't know what I was planning to do, only that I had to confront whatever waited for me. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. It felt as though the entire building were holding its breath, waiting for me to take the next step. In the hallway, I moved toward the door to the empty room. My hand shook as I reached for the knob, feeling the icy chill of the metal beneath my fingers. I twisted it slowly, half expecting it to be locked, but the door swung open without resistance, creaking on its hinges as I stepped inside. The room was dark, save for a faint light coming from the corner near the window. The air was thick and cold, carrying an odor that reminded me of damp earth and something else. Something decayed, like the remnants of something left to rot in the dark. As I moved further inside, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like unseen eyes watching me from every shadowed corner. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness. "Are you here?" For a moment there was nothing but silence, and then from the darkness a voice answered. "I'm here," it whispered, a faint, broken sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the same voice that had been calling me, the same voice that had whispered my name night after night. But now it was clearer, closer, and filled with a sorrow that made my chest ache. I followed the sound, moving toward the light in the corner. As I approached, I realized it was coming from a small, worn notebook lying open on the floor. The pages were yellowed, covered in jagged handwriting that looked hurried, desperate. I knelt down, picking up the notebook, my fingers trembling as I flipped through its pages. Each entry was filled with the same plea, repeated over and over. "Help me. I don't want to be alone. Help me." The handwriting grew messier, more frantic, as the pages went on, as if the writer had been consumed by fear and despair. Near the end of the notebook, I found an entry that made my blood run cold. "They're coming for me. I can hear them in the walls. They whisper my name, telling me to open the door, telling me they'll take me somewhere safe. But I know it's a lie. I know they want to trap me, to keep me here forever. Please, if someone finds this, don't let them take you too." I closed the notebook, a sense of horror settling over me. Whoever had written this had known what was coming for them, known they were doomed, and now it was reaching out to me, pulling me toward the same fate. A sudden noise made me freeze. Footsteps echoed from behind me, slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking across the room. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only shadows shifting, twisting into shapes that seemed almost human, almost real. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling the room with a sound that was both desperate and threatening. I backed away, my heart pounding as the shadows closed in around me, their shapes becoming clearer, more defined. Faces formed in the darkness, twisted and hollow-eyed, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Help us," they whispered, their voices blending together in a haunting chorus. "Help us. Join us." I stumbled backward, panic gripping me as I realized what they wanted. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a trap, A prison designed to lure in the living and keep them there, bound to the walls, trapped in endless despair. I felt their sorrow, their anger, their desperation pressing down on me, pulling me toward them with an invisible force that made it hard to breathe. "No," I gasped, forcing myself to move. "I can't. I won't." I turned, sprinting toward the door, my only thought to escape, to put as much distance as possible between me and the darkness clawing at my heels. But as I reached the threshold, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. I tugged on the handle, desperation taking over as the whispers grew louder, filling my head, drowning out my thoughts. "Daniel," they chanted, my name echoing in the voices of countless souls trapped in that room. "Stay with us. Forever." With a surge of strength, I threw my weight against the door, feeling it give way just enough for me to slip through. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, the oppressive weight of the voices fading as the door clicked shut behind me. I didn't look back. I ran down the stairs, my footsteps echoing as I fled the building. When I finally reached the street, the night air felt cold and sharp against my skin, grounding me, reminding me that I was free, that I had escaped. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The voices, the shadows, the plea for help, they clung to me, a memory that felt too real to be left behind. A week later, I moved out of the apartment. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I knew no one would believe me. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling my name from a place I never want to revisit. Months later, I saw an ad for the apartment building in the newspaper. Historic building with spacious rooms available for rent, quiet, peaceful surroundings. And I knew that soon someone else would take my place. Someone else would hear the whispers, the footsteps, the desperate plea for help echoing through the walls. But I wouldn't be there to save them. The first time I noticed him watching, I thought nothing of it. My new apartment was in a quiet area, surrounded by tall pine trees and narrow streets that felt hidden from the world. The complex was older, charming in a way, with faded paint and creaky staircases. It was a relief to be there, finally having my own space after a messy breakup that left me drained and needing solitude. The last thing I needed was more drama. The window in my living room faced the courtyard, giving me a view of the other apartments in the building. Across from mine, a few floors down, was the window of the apartment directly opposite. That was where I first noticed him. It was late, maybe 9 p.m., and I just finished unpacking a box of books. I glanced outside, feeling the pull of a long day, and caught a glimpse of him, standing there, looking out his window, with his gaze fixed right in my direction. At first, I assumed he'd been looking at something else, maybe lost in thought. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. But every night, without fail, around 9 p.m., he would appear at his window, standing there, looking out. The unsettling part was that he didn't seem to be doing anything. No phone, no book, no lights on in the background. Just him, alone in the shadows, looking out. After the first week, I grew uneasy. It was as if he were marking the time, an unspoken ritual that only he knew the meaning of. A few times, I tried ignoring him, staying away from the window altogether, but the thought of him out there staring gnawed at me. It was like knowing a ticking clock was in the room, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the sound. The feeling of being watched began to creep into my days, an invisible weight pressing down on me. In the mornings, when the light filtered softly through my curtains, I felt a small relief. Like the daylight offered a sort of protection. But by the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, a quiet dread would settle in. The idea of him being there, waiting, watching, haunted me. One evening, I tried confronting the feeling. I decided to sit by the window and face it, hoping that watching him directly would make it less terrifying. I turned off the lights in my apartment, moved a chair close to the window, and waited. It felt ridiculous, sitting there in the dark, hiding as if I were the one doing something wrong. Then, as if on cue, he appeared. He moved into the frame of his window, his figure partially obscured by shadows, but unmistakably there, staring back at me. I couldn't make out his features, just the outline of his face, but something about his stillness sent a chill through me. I shifted in my chair, and he seemed to notice, his head tilting ever so slightly, like he was acknowledging my presence. I couldn't stay there. I closed the blinds and moved away, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs. There was no logical reason to be so afraid. He hadn't done anything threatening. But the way he just lingered, as if he were waiting for something, made me feel exposed. Days passed, and I tried to convince myself it was just a strange habit of his, an odd quirk. Maybe he was lonely, and watching the courtyard was his way of feeling connected to something. But the unease didn't leave. Each night, I'd close my blinds tighter, feeling like I was shutting out something dark and heavy that wanted to seep in. Then came the first encounter outside the building. I was leaving for work early one morning when I saw him in the parking lot. He was partially hidden between two cars, standing in the shadows, watching as I made my way to my car. His presence was unexpected, unsettling in the early light, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. He didn't move, didn't greet me or nod. He simply watched, his face expressionless, almost vacant, like he was studying me. I hurried past, pretending I hadn't seen him, but the feeling of his eyes on my back stayed with me. Over the next few days, he started appearing more frequently, always at the edges of my routine. Once, I saw him in the hallway as I returned from a run. He was standing near my door, just lingering there as if waiting for something, though he said nothing. When I passed him, his gaze followed me, silent and intense. I wanted to ask him what he was doing, to tell him he was making me uncomfortable. But every time I thought about it, fear stopped me. There was something off about him. Something that made my instincts scream to stay away. But the longer this went on, the more trapped I felt. He was there, in every part of my life now, like a shadow that refused to disappear. As the days turned into weeks, his presence became almost predictable. I would see him in the parking lot when I left in the morning, in the hallway when I returned, and always at his window each night. It was as if he had somehow mapped out my schedule, knew exactly where I'd be, and made sure he was there to remind me of his silent, relentless gaze. The fear had started as a subtle unease, but it was growing, spreading through every corner of my life. My apartment no longer felt like a refuge. It was a cage, with his eyes always there, just beyond the walls, waiting. One evening, as I sat alone, a chilling realization crept over me. He wasn't just watching me. He was following me, studying my every move. And no matter where I went, he'd be there, a silent presence, always just out of reach, but close enough to make sure I never felt safe. I knew then that this wasn't something I could ignore any longer. I had to confront him, to ask why he was doing this. But the thought of facing him, of looking into those cold, unblinking eyes, filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me, like a thick, suffocating fog. Every creak of my apartment seemed louder, more ominous, as if the walls themselves were holding on to secrets. I went about my day in a daze, trying to focus on my work, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. But no amount of reasoning could erase the memory of his eyes fixed on me in the parking lot. or the way he seemed to drift around the building, always lingering just where I'd be. When I returned home that evening, a strange tension hung in the air. As I made my way down the hallway, I saw him standing by the door to his apartment, his gaze following me as I approached. I tried to ignore him, to keep walking as though he didn't exist, but his voice stopped me cold. "You forgot to lock your door last night," he said, his voice soft but carrying an edge that made my skin crawl. I froze, not daring to look at him. How would he know that? I was sure I had locked it, hadn't I? But the way he spoke as if he'd been right there made a chill run down my spine. "Excuse me?" I replied, my voice barely a whisper. I finally turned to look at him, and his expression was unreadable, a mask of something that almost looked like satisfaction. "You're too trusting," he continued, his gaze piercing through me. "People leave things unlocked all the time. Someone could just walk in." Every instinct screamed for me to get away from him, to put as much distance as possible between us. I forced myself to nod, mumbling something about being more careful, and hurried to my apartment, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. I leaned against the door, breathing heavily, my heart pounding as his words echoed in my mind. How long had he been watching me? How closely? The night passed slowly, each minute stretched by the oppressive silence that filled the apartment. I kept the lights on, too afraid to sit in the dark, half expecting to hear footsteps approaching my door. I barely slept, haunted by the thought of him standing outside, just waiting for the right moment to make his presence known again. In the following days, the tension continued to grow. Every time I left my apartment, I felt his eyes on me, watching from the hallway, from the parking lot, from the windows. I began to dread my own routine, changing the times I went out, taking different routes, trying anything to throw him off. But somehow, he always seemed to know. He was always there, just out of reach, waiting. One evening, desperate to escape the suffocating feeling of being watched, I decided to go to a nearby coffee shop that I rarely visited. I thought I could relax there, find a bit of peace, at least for a while. But as I sat there sipping my coffee and trying to lose myself in a book, I felt it. That familiar, unsettling sensation of being observed. I glanced up, my stomach twisting as I spotted him in the far corner of the shop. He was sitting there perfectly still, watching me with that same unreadable expression. It was as if he knew exactly where I'd be, as if he'd anticipated my every move. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I looked away, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. He was everywhere. No matter where I went, he found me. My mind raced, grasping at explanations, trying to understand how he could be following me so closely, so precisely. Maybe he had some app or device that tracked my phone? The thought made me feel sick, the idea that he could have access to something so personal. I quickly turned my phone off, slipping it back into my bag, but the sense of violation remained. When I returned home that night, my apartment felt different. There was something in the air, a stillness that didn't belong. I checked each room, even the closets, trying to reassure myself that I was alone. But as I reached my bedroom, I froze. My dresser drawers were slightly open, clothes peeking out as if someone had been rifling through them. I was certain I hadn't left them that way. A surge of terror washed over me, and I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. I could barely speak when the operator answered, my voice barely more than a whisper as I tried to explain that someone had been in my apartment. But as I looked around, desperate for some sign of forced entry, I realized with a sickening certainty that the locks were intact, the windows untouched. There was no evidence of anyone breaking in. The police arrived quickly, searching every corner of my apartment. They found nothing, No sign of an intruder, no explanation for the disturbances I'd noticed. The officer in charge gave me a sympathetic look as he spoke. It's possible someone managed to pick the lock, but there's no clear evidence of forced entry. Have you noticed anyone acting suspiciously around the building? I hesitated, glancing toward the door. I could feel my neighbor's presence through the walls, that silent, predatory energy that seemed to pulse just beyond my sight. Yes, I finally replied, my voice barely steady. There's a man, my neighbor. He watches me. Everywhere I go, he's there. The officer's expression darkened slightly, but he kept his tone professional. We can look into it. If he's been following you, we may be able to file a report. As the officers left, I felt a fleeting sense of relief, but it was short-lived. The moment the door closed behind them, the silence returned, heavy and oppressive, settling over me like a shroud. I locked the door, checking it twice, 3 times, before retreating to my bedroom. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to convince myself that everything would be fine, that the police would investigate, that I wasn't alone in this. But as the clock neared midnight, I heard a soft, deliberate tapping on my door. I sat up, my heart pounding, as I stared at the door, my mind racing with horror. The tapping was gentle, almost playful, as if he were testing my reaction, waiting for me to respond. I wanted to scream, to tell him to leave me alone, but fear held me silent, frozen in place. The tapping continued, each knock a chilling reminder that he was there, just on the other side, close enough to reach through the door if he wanted to. And in that moment, I realized something horrifying. He knew the police had left. He knew I was alone. As the tapping stopped, silence fell once more, but the dread remained, suffocating and thick. I lay there, staring at the door, feeling the weight of his presence, and I knew this wasn't going to end until one of us confronted the other. The tapping had stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. I lay in bed, feeling trapped, helpless, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. But where could I go? He was everywhere, inescapable, always watching. For a long time, I just sat there, barely breathing, listening to the oppressive quiet. I kept telling myself I'd confront him, that I'd march out there and demand he leave me alone. But the words felt hollow. Then, as if sensing my hesitation, I heard it. The subtle creak of floorboards just outside my door. My heart pounded as the reality hit me. He was still there, just beyond the door, waiting. I felt trapped. My apartment no longer a refuge, but a cage. I knew, without a doubt, that this would continue until I put an end to it myself. Summoning every bit of courage I had, I climbed out of bed, my legs trembling as I crossed the room. I hesitated only a second before twisting the lock and yanking the door open. The hallway was empty, but the air felt thick, charged with something dark, something wrong. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat louder than the last, as I looked around, half expecting him to appear from the shadows. And then I saw him, standing at the end of the hallway. His face was barely visible in the dim light, but I could see his eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes fixed on me with a calm intensity that chilled me to the bone. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smile curving his lips. "I was waiting for you to ask." The casual tone, the familiarity in his voice, made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to demand he leave, but he took a step closer, cutting off my words. "I know more about you than you think," he continued, his voice a low, unsettling murmur. "Where you go, what you do, even your thoughts. I know how you sleep, how you breathe. You can't hide from me, no matter where you go." A wave of nausea washed over me, and I stumbled back, my hand gripping the doorframe for support. How do you know all this?" He took another step forward, his expression darkening, that faint, eerie smile never fading. I make it my business to know. I follow, I watch. Every step you take is another piece of you that I gather. And the more I know, the closer I am. The horror of his words sank in, a creeping terror that felt like ice spreading through my veins. He wasn't just watching me, he was studying me, absorbing every part of my life until there was nothing left of me that he didn't own. I backed into my apartment, desperate to escape the suffocating presence that seemed to follow his every step. He stopped just outside my door, leaning forward, his face inches from mine. "You can run," he whispered, his breath chilling against my skin, "but I'll always find you." I slammed the door, locking it as fast as I could, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like his presence was pressing in on me, filling the room even though he was no longer there. I knew that staying here was no longer an option. I had to leave, had to get away as far as possible. In a frantic rush, I grabbed my keys, phone, and purse, not caring that I was barefoot, not even caring where I would go. I just needed to escape, to put as much distance as possible between me and that man, that creature who knew every detail of my life. The halls felt twisted, endless, each step echoing in the suffocating silence. I burst out into the night air, gasping, feeling the coolness cut through my panic. I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys, praying he wouldn't follow me. My hands shook as I unlocked the door and jumped in, locking it behind me. I started the engine, speeding out of the parking lot without looking back, the road stretching ahead like a lifeline. As I drove, I tried to think, to calm the overwhelming panic that clouded my mind. I wanted to go to the police, to tell them everything, but what could I say? That my neighbor had been following me, watching me, somehow knowing things he couldn't possibly know? It sounded insane, something no one would believe. And yet, the memory of his eyes, of that chilling smile, left no doubt in my mind. He was real, and he was relentless. After driving aimlessly for what felt like hours, I finally found myself at a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of town. I checked in, my voice barely a whisper as I handed over cash to the clerk. The room was dark, cold, but it felt safe, a temporary refuge where I could catch my breath. I locked the door, checked the windows, and sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion finally catching up to me. I thought of my apartment, of all the things I'd left behind, but I knew I could never go back. Not with him there, waiting. Somehow, I'd have to start over, to find a place he couldn't reach. But as the silence of the room settled around me, a terrible thought crept into my mind. What if he already knew I was here? What if he was just outside, watching, waiting? And then, almost as if answering my worst fears, I heard it. The faint, familiar tapping on the other side of the wall. When I first arrived at the house, it felt like stepping back in time. The Bradford Mansion, as my family called it, sat on the outskirts of Savannah, surrounded by ancient oak trees that cast long, creeping shadows over the grounds. The house itself was a looming, Gothic structure, its walls darkened with age, its windows watching me like old, faded eyes. I had never seen it before. In fact, I hadn't even known it existed until I inherited it. I was the last Bradford, or at least, that's what the attorney told me when he handed me the key. There were no other family members left to claim it, and I felt a strange mixture of pride and unease at the thought of being its final occupant. I had always heard whispers of my family's dark history, but I had written it off as old Southern folklore. The kind of stories people told to make their lives seem more interesting. As I stood in the grand entryway, gazing up at the dusty chandelier and the faded portraits lining the walls, I felt the weight of the house settle over me. It was silent, with only the faint sound of my own breathing and the creak of floorboards underfoot. The air was thick, almost stifling, and the smell of mildew mixed with a hint of something metallic hung in the air. I took my first few steps down the main hallway, trailing my fingers along the wallpaper, which was peeling in places, revealing layers of the house's history. The silence was almost oppressive, as though the house itself were holding its breath, watching me, waiting. Each room seemed frozen in time, filled with furniture covered in dust, as though my ancestors had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Exploring the mansion became my routine over the next few days. Each corner held traces of my family's past. An old doll here, a torn photograph there, each item hinting at a life that had long since faded. There was something intriguing about piecing together the lives of the people who had come before me, their stories woven into the walls. But as the days wore on, I started to notice things that didn't sit right. It began with the faintest of sounds, like whispers slipping through the walls, too soft to make out, but just loud enough to unsettle me. I brushed it off, chalking it up to old pipes or the groans of the ancient house settling. But the feeling persisted, a growing sense that I wasn't alone, that something lingered just out of sight. One evening, as I was exploring the library, I felt an odd chill sweep through the room. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath, and a prickling sensation crawled up my spine. I stood there, frozen, my eyes scanning the shadows, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, only the dim glow of my flashlight illuminating shelves filled with leather-bound books, their spines cracked with age. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself I was imagining things, but the whispers grew louder each night. Sometimes I thought I could make out fragments of words, names I didn't recognize, pieces of conversations that didn't belong to any time I knew. They came from the walls, from the floors, even from the heavy air around me, as if the house itself were trying to tell me something. Despite my unease, I found myself drawn to the whispers. There was a strange allure to them, a part of me that wanted to understand, to piece together the fragments of my family's past. I spent hours in the library, reading through old journals and letters, hoping to uncover some clue, some hint of what had happened here. But the more I searched, the more questions I uncovered. On the fourth night, something changed. The whispers, which had always been faint, barely more than a breath, grew louder, more insistent. I could hear them echoing down the hallways, winding through the rooms like a shadow. It was as if the house were trying to reach me, to make me understand. The air grew thick, pressing down on me, filling me with a sense of dread that was almost suffocating. I decided I'd had enough. It was late, nearly midnight, and I told myself that a good night's sleep would clear my head. I made my way to the front door, my footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. But when I reached for the handle, a strange resistance held the door shut. I pulled harder, but it wouldn't budge, as if some invisible force were holding it closed. A chill washed over me, and the whispers grew louder, their voices rising in a haunting, melodic tone. My heart pounded, and I stumbled back, feeling a strange presence filling the room. I spun around, my eyes searching the shadows, but there was no one there. Just the house, watching, waiting. I took a shaky breath, telling myself it was just my imagination, that the house was old and prone to quirks. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The house didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to stay, to listen, to uncover whatever secrets it held. I backed away from the door, retreating into the hallway. The whispers faded slightly, but the sense of unease lingered, wrapping around me like a second skin. I returned to my room, locking the door behind me, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. It was as if the house were giving me a moment of respite, a brief lull before it revealed whatever truth it held. I lay awake for hours, my mind racing with thoughts of the strange resistance at the door, the whispers, the chilling sense of being watched. I told myself that I would leave in the morning, that I would find a way out. But as the darkness pressed in around me, I had a sinking feeling that the house had no intention of letting me go. The next morning, I awoke with a lingering sense of dread. My room was filled with a strange stillness, the kind that presses down on you and leaves you feeling vulnerable. I rubbed my eyes, half convinced that the events of the previous night had been some twisted nightmare. But as I looked around, the chill from the night before seemed to hang in the air, like a shadow that refused to disappear. Determined to get out of the house, I dressed quickly and went straight to the front door. But when I reached for the handle, a familiar resistance met me. I pulled harder, putting my weight into it, but it wouldn't budge. My pulse quickened as a disturbing realization settled over me. The house was keeping me inside. I spent the morning exploring every exit, testing doors, checking windows, looking for any way to leave, but it was as if an invisible force held every opening shut. Even the windows, warped with age, refused to yield. I pressed my hands against the cold glass, looking out into the world just beyond my reach. I was trapped, and the house was silent, as if it were waiting for me to accept this new reality. With no other options, I returned to the library, the only place that offered a semblance of familiarity. The shelves, lined with old leather-bound volumes, seemed to hold secrets I hadn't yet unlocked. I scanned the titles, many of them thick with dust and decay, their spines cracked from years of neglect. Some were family records, others journals filled with handwriting that grew more frantic with each entry. The names in those journals were unfamiliar, yet each one felt connected to me, as if they were pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered through time. As I read through the journals, I began to notice a pattern. Each generation had its own entries, their words echoing the same sense of fear and dread I felt now. The writers described the house as if it were alive, as if it had moods, wants, even demands. Some mentioned hearing voices, whispers in the dead of night, while others described the house's resistance, an unyielding force that prevented them from leaving until they uncovered whatever secret it held. The most recent journal belonged to my great-uncle Samuel, a man I had never met, but whose words resonated with me on a deeply unsettling level. His final entries were frantic, scrawled in shaky handwriting that spoke of desperation. He wrote about hearing voices calling his name, about shadows moving just out of sight, and, most chilling of all, about a room he found in the basement. A room he claimed held the heart of the house and a secret too dark for anyone to bear. The further I read, the stronger the whispers around me became, like a low hum vibrating through the walls. It was as if the house were responding to my discovery, urging me to keep going. My eyes flickered to the shadows stretching across the room, twisting and shifting with a life of their own. I could feel them watching me, waiting, their presence growing stronger with each word I read. The entry ended abruptly, with a single haunting line that left me breathless. The house won't let me leave until I know, but some truths are too dangerous to learn. I closed the journal, the words echoing in my mind. There was something in this house, a truth buried deep within its walls, and it wanted me to find it. But at what cost? I thought about my family, the generations that had lived here, each one haunted by the same whispers, the same lingering presence. Had they all been trapped like I was, held captive by the house's will? Had they discovered this truth and paid the price for it? As the day wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were no longer just faint murmurs. They were words, fragments of conversations, snatches of voices that sounded both familiar and foreign. They came from the walls, from the floors, even from the air around me, filling the room with an energy that felt heavy and alive. "Daniel," one voice called, low and mournful. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up as my name echoed through the silence. I looked around, but there was no one there, only the empty room and the shadows creeping closer. The voice sounded like a relative, like one of the family members whose names I had just read, but twisted, distorted, as if time had warped it into something unrecognizable. Desperate for answers, I began to search the house again, moving from room to room, listening to the voices as they whispered secrets I had never known. Some were confessions, others were warnings, but each one felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, a dark legacy my family had tried to hide. I found myself drawn to the basement, the place my great-uncle had mentioned in his final entry. The stairs were narrow and steep, descending into darkness that seemed to swallow all light. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I gripped the railing. But something compelled me to move forward, an invisible force that pulled me down each step until I stood at the bottom, my heart pounding in the silence. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick and heavy, carrying a scent of damp earth and decay. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the walls, twisting into shapes that almost looked human. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on an old, rotting door at the far end. The wood was warped, swollen with age, and yet something about it called to me. As I approached, I felt a surge of energy ripple through the room, a sense of something ancient and powerful awakening. The whispers rose to a crescendo, filling my head with a cacophony of voices that drowned out all thought. My hand shook as I reached for the door, feeling the cold metal of the handle beneath my fingers. For a moment, I hesitated, my mind racing with questions and fears. But before I could pull away, the door swung open on its own, revealing a small, dark room filled with objects I didn't recognize. Strange, twisted relics, fragments of memories that seemed almost alive, as if they had been waiting for me. At the center of the room was a stone altar, worn and weathered, covered in symbols I couldn't decipher. The whispers fell silent, the sudden quietness almost deafening. I stepped inside, feeling the air grow colder, heavier, as if I had crossed a threshold into another world. The altar seemed to pulse with a life of its own, each beat echoing through the room, resonating with the very walls of the house. It was then that I realized the truth. This was the heart of the house, the source of its power, the place where my family's darkest secrets were kept. And as I stood there, the weight of those secrets pressed down on me, filling me with a sense of dread that was beyond anything I had ever known. I stood before the altar, the air around me thick with a silent tension. The house, which had been filled with whispers and restless energy, was now silent, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls, twisting and curling into shapes that seemed almost alive. The silence pressed in, amplifying the steady, low thrum that seemed to pulse from the altar itself, as though the stone was breathing. As I drew closer, I could feel a pull, an almost magnetic force urging me forward. My hand trembled as I reached out, fingertips brushing the cold, rough surface of the stone. The whispers returned, softer now, curling around me like smoke, their words indistinct but laced with a haunting familiarity. I couldn't make sense of them, yet they felt as if they were speaking directly to my soul, each word reverberating deep within me, On the altar lay a collection of items: an old key, tarnished with age, a lock of hair bound with a faded ribbon, and a diary, its leather cover cracked and worn. I opened the diary, the pages brittle and yellowed, filled with the same frantic handwriting I had seen in my great-uncle's journal. The words were hurried, almost panicked, as if he'd been racing against time to write them down. "The house demands its truth to be known," one entry read. "Each of us bound to it, each of us consumed by it." My heart raced as I turned the pages, each line more unsettling than the last. He wrote of an ancient pact, a deal struck by an ancestor I had never heard of, a bargain that granted prosperity to the family but bound every descendant to the house and its secrets. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with fragments of stories, memories that weren't mine. Images flashed before my eyes, faces twisted with fear, voices calling out in desperation, the echoes of lives spent within these walls, trapped by an invisible hand. The voices grew into a crescendo, each one clamoring for release, for an end to their captivity. They wanted freedom, a release from the house's grip, and they wanted me to make it happen. My hand moved almost on its own, reaching for the key on the altar. The moment my fingers closed around it, a surge of energy coursed through me, filling me with a sense of purpose, of duty. The house, its whispers now a relentless chorus, seemed to guide me, urging me down a narrow corridor that I hadn't noticed before, a hidden passageway just beyond the altar. The corridor was cold, lined with stone, leading down deeper into the earth. I could feel the weight of the house above me, pressing down as though it were watching my every step, waiting to see what I would do. The passage twisted and turned, the walls close and damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. Finally, I reached the end, a small chamber with walls that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. In the center of the room was another altar, simpler than the one above, but covered in strange symbols and surrounded by a ring of candles, their flames casting an eerie glow that illuminated the space. The whispers grew quiet, and I could feel the presence of the house more intensely than ever, as if it were all around me, listening, waiting. I set the key on the altar, feeling a strange compulsion to complete the ritual, to unlock whatever truth the house held. But as I stood there, my hand hovering over the key, doubt crept in. Was this what the house wanted, or was it a trap, something meant to bind me to its secrets forever? A voice, softer than the rest, broke the silence. It was different from the others, familiar, almost like my own, but laced with a deep sadness. "Daniel, you can end this, but know that some truths are too dark to bear." My heart pounded as the weight of the decision settled over me. If I left the key untouched, perhaps the house would let me go, leave me with only the memories of its shadows. But if I turned the key, if I chose to unlock the truth, I might find something I couldn't unsee, a darkness that could consume me just as it had consumed everyone before me. The whispers surged, louder now, filling the room with a desperate energy. They wanted release, a final end to their endless vigil. They begged me to turn the key, to set them free, but I could feel the weight of their despair pressing down on me, like a burden I wasn't meant to carry. My hand trembled, my mind racing with the choice before me. The room seemed to pulse with anticipation, the house waiting, holding its breath as I stood at the threshold of its secrets. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold metal of the key in my hand, and closed my eyes. In that moment, I realized that no matter what I chose, the house would never truly let me go. I was a Bradford, bound to this place by blood and history, connected to its secrets in ways I couldn't fully understand. I could leave, but the whispers, the memories, the haunting weight of the house's legacy would follow me, lingering in the shadows, a reminder of the truth I had dared not uncover. With a final, trembling breath, I released the key. Stepping back from the altar, the whispers grew quiet, the room filling with a heavy silence, as if the house were disappointed, its secrets left untouched for another generation. I turned, making my way back up the dark corridor, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on me, as though it were watching me leave, its hold on me unbroken, its secrets left hidden, for now.